All right, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. I want to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the shurim and drashos this month in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kallman, Eli'ezer, Halevi, Zichron Lebrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We thank Avi Tobias for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in appreciation of the Daf Yomi Shir and of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful Torah. Our week of learning sponsors, Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin, for dedicating the learning this week in the merit of a refuah sheleima for Chava Tzipporah, Bas Chaya Malka. Our day of learning sponsor today, Nina Allen-Goldberg, in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of her mother, Miriam Rosenbaum Garfield, Miriam Bat Avraham. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama shall have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And our Daf Yomi sponsor, Bennett Goldberg, for dedicating the shir today in honor of his birthday. Baruch Hashem, outside Sira Bennett on Zoom over here. Baruch Hashem, Chalash Baruch Hu, Bennett should bench you with another beautiful year filled with mazel, with bracha, with hatzlacha, with parnasa, with kol mishalos libecha, ameh ve'esem shanim tovos. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. So today's daf is Yud Gimel 13. We are picking up on Yud Beis Amud Beis 18b, and we're actually picking up 18 lines up from the bottom. Let's actually pick up with the last line we did in yesterday's daf. Some Rav Chanana Amar Rav. Rav Chanana said in the name of Rav, Kotzeitz Adam Deka b'Moed, a person could cut down a palm tree on Chalamoid, Afa Pishin Tzarech Elo L'Nesor, even though a person only needs the sawdust. So this is the last halacha we saw in yesterday's daf. So even though, again, all I need is the sawdust, right? And the sawdust is a relatively small and insignificant byproduct of a much larger malacha. Nevertheless, Rav said that halacha l'maisa, you could cut down the palm tree for the sawdust. Layit ala Abaye. Abaye went ahead, and I will say layit literally means cursed. Abaye cursed the person who went ahead and did this. Meaning Abaye felt it was an unjustifiable amount of malacha for a very, very small result. So it says the Gemara, Rabashi, Havale Abba Bashleina, goes listen to this story. So Abaye had Rashi says, Abba is a yar Bashleina. Like Bashleina, right? Bashleina was the name of the city, or right? Bishalaina was the name of the city. See, he had a forest. Rashi had a forest. He went to cut down some trees during Chalamayid. Amali Rav Shila Mishalaina l'Ravashi. But Rav Shila from Shalaina said to Ravashi, I might daitech. Why are you cutting down trees? The Kama Rav Chanana Amarav Kotzeitz Adam Deka b'Moed. Afa Pishin Tzarech Elo L'Nesor. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so Ravashi said, well look, Rav said, you're allowed to cut down palm trees even though you just need the sawdust. So therefore again, Ravashi said, that's why I'm pasking like, but Rav Shila said to him, Halai Dala Abaye. But yet Abaye said this is an inappropriate practice, right? Abaye went ahead and cursed someone who went ahead and lived by this practice. Samarle lo shmiali. So Rashi said, I never heard it. Now he didn't mean I never heard it. Rather, what did he say? Kilomar lo svirali. I don't hold of that. Right? I don't hold of Abaye. I hold of Rav. So the Gemara says, Ishtamit nargo. As he was cutting down the trees, he almost had an accident, and the axe almost went into his thigh. So he recognized, right, v'hadra asa. So Ravashi recognized that this accident, right, this near, I don't know, it's a near-death experience, but certainly this near significant injury experience was an omen that ultimately, again, he was disrespectful of the position of Abaye, and therefore again stopped cutting down trees. All right, so I was saying an interesting story. Rav Yehuda shari leme'akar kisna ulemekdal kishusa uleme'akar shumshimi. Rav Yehuda permitted on Chalamayid. So I was saying leme'akar kisna means to go ahead and cut flax. Leme'akar kisna, right? Leme'akar kisna lemikdal kishusa, to harvest or to cut hops, or leme'akar shumshimi, and to go and uproot sesame. uproot sesame. So the Gemara says, Amrle Abai Rav Yosef, Bishlam Kisna Chazila Chatifa. So I understand flax is beneficial on Chalamayid. How so? Because it can be used to cover up food. Kishusa Chazila Shichra. Hops can be made into beer. Ela Shumshimi Lamai Chazi. But sesame, what is sesame used for? So the Gemara says, "Lamai chazi l'naziyei deispehu." But the interest of what it means is sesame. Generally, when you harvest it, is not a readily usable item. There's still much production that has to be done to it. So, what is it usable? To which the Gemara says, "No. When you harvest or you cut down sesame, there are small little seeds inside of the sesame plant that are already ready for immediate use. So, therefore, it serves an immediate chalamayid use." Rabbi Yanai Havale Yahu Pardesa, Demata Zimne B'chola Demoda Katve. So what happened? This is very interesting. Rabbi Yanai had a particular orchard, and ultimately, again, the time to harvest the orchard came on Chalamayid, and therefore he had it harvested. So so remember again, we spoke about this already now, that could have been a situation of a hefsid meruba, right? That if he's going to incur significant loss by not harvesting it now, ultimately it's permitted. It could have been a poal, right? A worker that had no other work to do, and therefore again, Rabbi Yanai allowed him to cut down the orchard. It could have been a variety of things. Rabbi say, remember again, this entire time, one of the constant themes, last 2 days, one of the themes that have kept coming up is what we'll call the Adam Chashuv motif. And what's the Adam Chashuv motif? Right? That when you are a high-profile person, it could very well be that you have to conduct yourself in a different way. And it's not just enough to go ahead and make sure that something is mutter, but rather something could be mutter, but it might not be the right thing for you to do because people may learn from your behaviors and may come to glean erroneous conclusions from your behaviors. So what happens? So here Rabbi Yanai went ahead and had his orchard harvested on Chalamayid. So it says the Gemara, L'shana shayua kuli amala pardesayu l'chola demoada. So we'll say, so the next year what happened? Well, once people saw that Rabbi Yanai is harvesting his orchard on Chalamayid, so what did they do? Everybody purposely delayed the harvesting of their fields until Chalamayid. They figured, hey, if Rabbi Yanai can harvest his field in Chalamayid, we can harvest our field in Chalamayid. And it's great, by the way, right? Chalamayid, again, often, like we said before, I'm not doing my regular day job, right? I'm not doing other work. I have some more time. It's more relaxed. It's a nice Chalamayid activity for the family. So people intentionally delayed the harvesting of their field until Chalamayid. To which the Gemara said, what happened? So Rabbi Yanai realized, after Rabbi Yanai Pardesa Ushasa, Rabbi Yanai made his entire field hefker that year. Rashi says, why did he make his field hefker? After Rabbi Yanai Pardesa, Mishum da'al yado haya takala li alma, tishahu ad lechola demoda k'tuve. Because Rabbi Yanai realized that although it was not his intention, at the end of the day, his act led people to make a mistake. So because he was so upset about this, he did not want to benefit from the orchard, and therefore he made it hefker. So we'll say so again, it's fascinating how the Gemara kind of ends off with this piece. We've been speaking about Adam Chashuv shiny, and here's a story where you see how an Adam Chashuv really has to go out and conduct himself in accordance with a different kind of standard. Beautiful. We'll say Mishnah. Machnis Adam Peirosav Nihaganavim. A person could bring his produce in from the field if he's concerned about thieves. Right? So here's concerned about thieves from theft. I could bring in my produce. Again, if I had flax that was soaking, I could pull it out of the water in order that it not suffer a loss. So we'll say this is always the dominant theme. You could do these things to stave off a loss as long as what? You did not intentionally leave it for Chalamayid. But I will say, but if you intentionally left the malacha for Chalamayid, Chazal penalized you. Right? So, as much as this entire time, we're only 12 blocked into Moed Katan, but we've seen this theme over and over and over, that you could do malacha for the sake of a davar avod, but if you intentionally leave your work for Chalamayid, Chazal penalized you and you can't do it. Good. Says the Gemara, Tana, we'll say, by the way, with the produce piece, so we give you a license to move your produce into your house in order to save yourself from theft. but when doing that, you have to do that in a private fashion. Right? In other words, we don't want malacha done in a public way, and the act of moving fruit, right, could be a lot of work, moving produce. So do it in a way, but do it privately. So the Gemara says, Rav Yosef Havilei Kishure. Rav Yosef had certain beams that were left outside, and he had to move them into his house in order to prevent theft. That's a davar ha'ovid. So Aylinhu b'yamama. He brought it in during the day. So Amarle Abai v'atayna b'vashach yisim b'tzina b'sov beiso. So Abai says, Rav Yosef, but the Mishnah said you should do it privately. So shouldn't you have moved the beams into your home at night? So listen to this. Amarle tzina dahani yamamahu. The best private way to move these beams is by day. Why is that? Listen to this. So the Gemara says, "The kevan de balayla boy gavri yiseru by miduchre denura of shamilsa." Because if you try to move beams at night, what do you need? First of all, you need manpower, right? Second of all, you need torches. So the idea of also is it's actually so much of even though night potentially affords you kind of like the cover of secrecy, but it's not really, because you're going to have a lot more people involved. You're going to need torches. So this way, the best way to do this in private, so to speak, is to do it by day. Incredible. Says the Rav Shola Pishalom and Mishra, and you could go ahead and pull your flax out of the water in order to stave off a loss. And I will say, now the last part of the Mishnah said that what? That halacha l'maisa, if you intentionally left your malacha for chalamayid, then ultimately, even if it's a davar ha'ovid, a potential loss, Chazal penalized you, and you cannot do the malacha. Supposed to listen to this fascinating shaila. Ba'imini Rabbi Yomi Rabbi Zera, kivin malachta Moed umeis. We'll say, let's say we have this case where a person intentionally left his work for chalamayid. Intentionally, right? So let's say a person had, whatever the case is, right? The person left his flax soaking inside of the water, and he intentionally left it there until chalamayid to take it out. So I'll say, so now the Mishnah says, he's penalized, he can't take it out, he has to suffer the loss. Listen to this shaila. Umeis. So we'll say, let's call the guy Ruvain. Ruvain intentionally left his flax in the water until he could have taken it out before chalamayid. He purposely left it in there until chalamayid, figuring I'll have time there to take care of it. Fine. So what's the halacha for Ruvain? He can't take out the flax. Let's say Ruvain dies. Now Ruvain has a son, Shimon. Right? So we'll say, so what's the shaila? Maushi yiknusu banav acharov. So we'll say, listen to this. Does the penalty apply to his son Shimon or not? So now Ruvain died, right? Ruvain is the person who intentionally left the malacha for chalamayid. So now do we say that the penalty devolves upon the son as well, and the son Shimon can't remove the flax from the water as well? Or no, so we'll say, you're going to see, what's the shaila over here? It's fascinating. The shaila is the penalty a din in the gavra or in the chefza? When Chazal penalized you if you did not do malacha you could have done before Yom Tiv, but you didn't do it. Is the penalty in the individual, or is the penalty on the object? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is if the transgressor died. So now, does his heir have the same penalty or not? Well, it depends. If the penalty is a din of the gadra, a din of the individual, then once Ruvain dies, the penalty dies with him. But if the penalty is a din in the chefza, in the item, then Shimon, the inheritor, can't remove the flax as well. Imtim, so I will say, top of Yud Gimel, Imtim Salama. So the Gemara tries to figure this out. Let's analyze. Saram Ozem Bachar. Let's listen to this case. You have a Bachar animal, right? Bachar is a firstborn animal. What do you do with your firstborn animal? You give it to the Kohen. With one exception, which is if the animal develops a mum, a blemish. So let's say again, you're too impatient. I'm Yisrael, I'm too impatient for nature to take its course. So what do? I blemish the animal, right? I nick the ear of the animal. So we'll say, so remember again, what's talach? It's very interesting. So let's say Ruvain has a bachar animal. Ruvain goes in and purposely blemishes it. Then Ruvain dies. Now he has a son, Shimon. Shimon inherits him. Now Shimon has the bachar animal. So what's the status of the bachar animal? So no, the knas is still on the animal. Right? In other words, Shimon, the inheritor, cannot get benefits from this animal because it's right. The penalty seems to devolve upon the object, not the person. The Gemara says it's not a good raya. Why? Because remember again, purposely blemishing a bachar animal is an Isur D'Oraisa. So maybe by an Isur D'Oraisa, biblical prohibition, the obligation, or I should say the penalty, devolves upon the object. Vimtim Salomar, another case, Machar Avdoli Oved Kochavim Umeis. But let's say the following case. The halacha is you are not permitted to sell your non-Jewish servant to a non-Jewish master. Right? That's the halacha. And if you go ahead and you sell your non-Jewish servant, your Eved Kinani, to a non-Jewish master, you are obligated to redeem that servant even if it requires an exorbitant amount of money. So let's say Reuven sold his Eved Kinani, and then Reuven dies, his son Shimon is still obligated to go ahead and redeem this servant. Which I will say, once again, sounds like that what? Whenever there is a penalty, the penalty devolves upon the object, not upon the person. And therefore the inheritor is still subject to the penalty. So Kansobno Acharov, to which Gemara says that's not a good raya either. Mishum dechol yoma mafki le mimitzos. You will say, why is there a penalty if you sell an Eved Kinani to a non-Jewish owner? Because remember again, an Eved Kinani has an obligation of mitzvos. Right? Now again, he has a limited obligation of mitzvos, but an obligation nevertheless. So because when you sold him, you actively removed him from his ability to go out and fulfill mitzvahs, that's why you're obligated to redeem him. So we'll say, Shiloh over here is in our case, what's the halacha? So we'll say now back to Chalamai. So in a very simple case, right? Reuven purposely delayed malacha until Chalamai. So let's just keep the case of the Mishnah. He put his flax in water. He could have removed it before Yom Tiv. He purposely delayed it until Chalamai. So what did the Mishnah say? Reuven would be penalized, and Reuven cannot remove the flax. He has to suffer the loss. Now Reuven dies. Shimon inherits him. Is Shimon allowed to remove the flax from the water or not? Is the penalty on the individual, in which case if Reuven died, the penalty dies with him, or is the penalty on the object, on the cheftza, in which case even the inheritor Shimon cannot remove the flax from the water? Gavra kanis Rabbana v'halei say, do we say that the penalty is upon the individual Reuven and Reuven is dead? O Dilma, Mamona kanis grabanon v'ha'isei, or maybe no, the penalty is on the money, and ultimately on the object, and the object is still extant. Amrle tinisua. We learn this. Sadesh in his kavtza b'shvius. We'll say if you remove, this kavtza means you removed thorns. If you have a field from which thorns were removed during Shemitah, tizra l'matzei shvius. You could go ahead and seed that field on matzei shvius. Netaiba o nedaira. If you are to head netaiba, also means the field was fertilized. Now, netaiba, we'll see, by the way, both netaiba and nedaira both means the field was fertilized, but it's two different ways of fertilizing. Netaiba means you bring in like wagon loads of fertilizer and fertilize the field that way. Nedaira is what we saw in yesterday's daf, where you corral the animals in different places on the field, and they naturally fertilize the field. So what's the halacha? If you fertilize the field, lo tizra l'matzei shvius, you are not permitted to go ahead and sow the field on matzei shvius. Now here's what's interesting. The act of fertilizing the field on Shemitah is an Isur D'Rabbanan. It's not an Isur D'Oraisa, right? The Isur D'Oraisa for Shemitah is to actively work the field. Fertilizing is a D'Rabbanan. Yet what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, even when you violate the D'Rabbanan, there's a knas, there's a penalty. And what does the penalty devolve upon? Sounds like it devolves upon the object, right? The field may not be sown on matzei shvius. So it sounds like, again, knas, rabbinic knasos, rabbinic penalties, don't devolve upon people, they devolve upon objects. To which the Gemara Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi Bechanina, Naktinon, Hetiva, Umeis, Bino, Zora. But yet we learned, here's the problem. We did learn that what? That halacha l'maisa, if let's say Reuven enhanced the field in some way, in other words, thereby violating Shemitah, Umeis, and then he died, Bino Zora, that his son is permitted to sow the field. Which I will say sounds like what? That penalties devolve upon what? People and not things, and not objects. Alma, lididei kansurabanan, Alma, lididei kansurabanan, libre lo kansurabanan. Therefore, Bose, what do you see from the Shemitah case? From the Shemitah case, you see that the when Chazal penalize something, they penalize the person. they penalized the transgressor, they did not penalize the object. Therefore, again, if the father enhances the field and then the father dies, the son, the inheritor, is permitted to work the field on Matzei Shvius. Again, penalty devolves upon object, not upon person. Hachinami, therefore the Gemara says over here by Chalamayid as well, Lididei kansu rabbanon, lebrelo kansu rabbanon. I will say this seems to be the conclusion of the Gemara, which is really quite fascinating, that when Chazal went ahead and made a penalty, created a penalty, knas, the knas devolves upon the perpetrator, upon the person, but not upon the object. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the way the Gemara is ending off in this sugya, is that if Reuven goes ahead and purposely leaves malacha for chalamayid, so the Mishnah said we knas him, we penalize him. So therefore, again, Reuven cannot pull out the flax from the water, even though it's a davar oven. He has to suffer a total loss. But should Reuven pass away and his son Shimon now inherits, Shimon now owns the flax, the knas is not on Shimon, right? The knas is on the individual, and therefore Shimon would be permitted to go ahead and remove the flax from the water. The knas devolves upon the person, not upon the object. It is a din in the gavra, not a din in the chefza. Incredible. Amar Abaye says, Nachtinan, well, not totally finished yet. Nachtinan, Timei Taros of Omes, Lo Kansu B'no Acharav. So let's listen to this. An interesting case. Let's say Reuven goes over to Levi, and Reuven purposely makes Levi's tahar items tameh. Right? Levi's got truma, and Reuven takes a mouse and he puts the mouse on top of the truma. Then he walks away. Right? So he goes ahead and he defiles the truma of Levi. So what's talacha? Timi tarosav umeis lo kansu b'no acharav. Shabbos says, so now when you go ahead and you're metame someone, Shabbos say, interestingly enough, you're tame someone's taros, so the rabbis penalized you. You have to pay. So what's talacha? Let's say Reuven dies before he has the opportunity to pay the penalty. What's the halacha? Lo kansu b'no acharav. Now Shimon, the son of Reuven, doesn't have to pay his father's penalties, which once again sounds like that what? Penalties, kenosos, devolve upon individuals, not upon objects. To which the Gemara says, that's a different case. My taima, hazik shenonikar lo shma hazik. Ledidei kans rabbanon, lebrelo kans rabbanon. We'll say, so this, the Gemara says, this is an outlier case, because it's actually quite fascinating. Remember, if you go over and you defile someone's truma, let's say, we'll say, I get into a fight with my neighbor who's a Kohen, and I say, you know what, I'm going to give it to this guy. I take a dead sheretz, and I put it on his truma, and I walk back home. And I will say, by the way, it's the best thing. Why? Because I see him eating that truma, and he thinks he's mamish Aaron the Kohen Gadol, eating his truma. They're looking down on me. I'm eating my chulin, he's eating his truma, and I realize, good. Yeah, now how's that truma? Right? How's that truma tameya? Right? Going for you. So let's say, see, here's what's interesting. I've caused damage, but it's unrecognizable damage. Right? It's unrecognizable damage. That's called hezik she'eno nikar. We'll get to these sugyas in the zikin. So it's fascinating. In other words, externally, nothing has changed about that truma. But at the end of the day, I have caused damage. So we'll say, really in halacha, hezik she'eno nikar, lo shmei hezik. When you cause damage that's not recognizable, that's not called damage, at least in a monetary sense. Right? You can't really, how do you go, you can't really measure damages like that. But yet, the rabbis penalized you. In other words, there's a knas. There is a knas. Even though, again, there's no visible damage, we know you did damage, and therefore there's a knas. So I will say, so again, since this is a knas, once again, who does the knas devolve upon? The knas devolves upon the individual, not upon the object. So if Reuven caused unrecognizable damage to his Kohen neighbor, and then Reuven dies, the obligation to pay that knas does not devolve upon Shimon, the surviving heir. So Rabbi say what indeed becomes the conclusion of this sugya is that halacha l'maisa, when Chazal imposed the knas, they imposed the knas upon the perpetrator, right, and not upon the object. Therefore, should the transgressor die, ultimately the knas dies with him, and the heir does not have any relationship to that knas. So therefore, I will say again, for a chalamayid purpose, if Reuven transgressed and purposely left malacha to chalamayid, Reuven himself would not be permitted to do the malacha and would have to suffer the loss. But if Reuven dies, then Shimon, the inheritor, is permitted to do the malacha, doesn't have to suffer the loss. Beautiful. Mishnah. On chalamayid, you can't purchase homes, servants, or animals unless, of course, you need them for chalamayid. O litzorach hamocher she'en lo mayochal. Or, we will say again, going back to what we said before, if the seller is impoverished, right, and doesn't have what he needs for Yom Tiv, you could purchase one of these items in order to give him funds. So we already saw in yesterday's sugi, a little bit different. And we'll say here, the lashon is mocher. So by minei Rav Nachman, so Rav asked Rav Nachman the following shayla, schar pu'ula she'en lo mayochal mahu. So we'll say, so the Mishnah phrases this as a mocher ve'en lo mayochal, a seller who doesn't have what to eat. What about a worker? Right? What about a worker? Right? What's the halacha by a worker who doesn't have what to eat? Can you go ahead and hire him to do work as well? So the Gemara says, so if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, almost right across from Rashi, Schar pu'ula she'en lo mayochal, she'en lo po'el mayochal, she'en lo lepo'el mayochal, mahu, shitin lo malachal, l'soch lo kedei she'en lo echal. So we'll say, here's the shayla. The Mishnah tells me, mocher, a seller who doesn't have what to eat, I can buy something from him. What about a worker? So I'm like, Tanina, so we learn this, right, where the Mishnah says, so what does it mean, So the Gemara says, what does that come to include? So the Gemara says, does that not come to include even a worker? She said, no. That's ultimately, again, coming to interpret the previous phrase. That when the Mishnah said that you can go ahead and purchase homes, servants, and livestock, L'tzorech hamoed. Tzorech hamoed means different things. Tzorech hamoed can mean because I need it, or tzorech hamoed can mean because the seller needs it. But it doesn't necessarily tell me anything about a worker. To which the Gemara says, Eisvei Abaye Sabai is the kasha in kosvin shtari chov b'moed. But so you're not allowed to write loan documents on chalamayid. But if you don't believe him, then I will say, what does it mean? Don't believe who? If the lender doesn't believe the borrower, doesn't trust the borrower, or he has nothing to eat. Then you could write a loan document. Who doesn't have what to eat? Who doesn't have what to eat? Who's the person who doesn't have what to eat in this case? The sofer. We'll say, listen to this. This is, because remember, again, I both say, who benefits if you write documents? So obviously, from a transactional perspective, the lender benefits. But I both say, remember again, if you're drafting a document, remember, we'll say it's not a new thing that people charge money for drafting documents, right? That lawyers charge money for drafting documents. So before the lawyers, it was a scribe, right? You hired a sofer, the sofer writes the document. So therefore, we'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, normally, you can't go ahead and write loan documents on chalamayid. But if the lender doesn't believe the borrower, so ultimately, again, you could draft the document, or ein lo mayochal, or he doesn't have what to eat. Who's the he? The he is the sofer, right? The drafter, right? If you know a guy who, this is what he does, he drafts documents, and he does not have what he needs for Yom Tiv, halacha l'maisa, you could hire him to go ahead and draft the document, even if, by the way, even in a case where the lender totally believes the borrower. So we'll say, what do you see from here? So the Gemara says, Shema Mina, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, it's not just mocher ve'in lo mayochal, but it's also poel ve'in lo mayochal. That if you have a worker or a laborer and he doesn't have what he needs for chalamayid, we'll say, by the way, also it doesn't have to, Rashi points out, it doesn't have to be so extreme that he doesn't have any food, right? It could also, he just doesn't have, what he needs, everything he needs for Yom Tiv. In that kind of case, you can hire him to do work as well. Incredible. Most of Rav Sheshes says, V'chom say, Shalosh omnios osin malacha ba'arvei psachim. So we'll say, we're going to now raise a kasha to this based on a different halacha. This is the halacha ultimately again of Erev Pesach. So listen to this. There are 3 professions that are permitted to do work on Erev Pesach. What are the 3 professions? Ad chatzos, until midday. Who are the 3 professions? Hachayatin, tailors, saparin, barbers, kovsin, launderers. Right, now why is this? Hachayatin, shekin hedyo tofer kedarker. Now both say, now here's what's interesting about this. The Braisa is linking Malachan Erev Pesach to Malachan Chalamayid. So we let the tailor go ahead and work the same way that a tailor, right? Because where it says sewing, right? Especially again if a person is not a professional, is permitted on Chalamayid. So the same way that sewing is permitted on Chalamayid, it's going to be permitted on Erev Pesach as well. Hasaparin va'kovsin. So ultimately again, barbers and launderers, shekin, they could do malacha on Erev Pesach up until Chatzos. Shekin abam dinas hayom vayotzi beis hasurin mutar l'sar. This is going to be the new parak. Tomorrow's Daf Yomi Hashem. We're going to see because under certain normally, taking a haircut and doing laundry is asar and chalamayid. Sometimes it's mutter. When is it mutter? Ultimately, people who are coming from overseas and didn't have the ability to engage in these malachas prior to chalamayid. So, someone travels from overseas, someone was released from prison. So these individuals, mutar l'sapar l'chabis v'chol shamoid. So now that we're establishing this connection, so what it sounds like over here is that what? What it sounds like is that halacha l'maisa, you could do malacha on Erev Pesach up until Chatzos as long as what? Some form of that malacha would be permitted on Chalamayid as well. Now, if that's the relationship here, first wide line, you'd give one dollar. Schar pu'ula she'in l'mayochal shari kamalachos nami lishtaru da'ikas schar pu'ula she'in l'mayochal. They will say, now, if you hold that a pa'al ve'in l'mayochal, that a worker who doesn't have what he needs for Yom Tiv is permitted to work on Chalamayid, you could hire him to work on Chalamayid. And I will say, what kind of work can you hire him to do on Chalamayid? What kind of work? Sounds like anything. Right? It doesn't, if you notice, by the way, the Gemara is not placing any restrictions on what he can do. If that's the case, then really what it means is there is a circumstance in which any type of malacha is permitted on Chalamayid. In that case, every type of malacha should be permitted on Erev Pesach up until Chatzos. So maskif la papa elmeata binyan lishteri. But if that's the case, building should also be permitted. Why? Shekin kosel agol shrabim sosra bonakidarkum neasakana. But we learn this. What's halacha and chalamayid? If you have a wall that is kind of slanting into the Rosh Hashanah, and there's a potential danger of collapse, what are you permitted to do on chalamayid? Deconstruct it and reconstruct it. So building should also be permitted on Erev Pesach. Maskil for Ravina. So I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, Maskil for Ravina. El me'ata lav lo lishtri shekin kosi kedushin Hashem yidev shovrin. Furthermore, again, we should allow the scribe to do his thing on Erev Yom Tov as well. Why? Because on Chalamayid, you're permitted to write documents of Kiddushin, documents of Gittin, Shovrin, which is a receipt for payment of a Ksuva. Ela Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi says no. Moed Arba Asar Karamis. So we'll say you're comparing two dissimilar things. As much as the Brisa linked them, there's two different principles driving these things. At the end of the day, Moed Mishum Tirchahu Ubemakum Psida Sharabanan. They will say, why can't you do Malach and Chalamayid? It's very important. Why can't you do Malach and Chalamayid? One word, Tircha. Tircha. Because Chalamayid is still Yom Tiv, and therefore, again, we don't want you engaging in unnecessary exertion. So Tircha is what drives the prohibitions on Chalamayid. When did Chazal lift the prohibition of Tircha, or when did they lift it? Welcome to say that in a situation of loss. And I will say, loss looks different ways. Loss could mean if I don't do something, ultimately, again, I'm going to suffer a loss. Or loss could also mean someone doesn't have what they need, and they're living in a constant state of loss. Therefore, I could allow them to do malacha. That's what drives Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, both say, what's the license to do malacha on Erev Yom Tiv, on Erev Pesach? Anything that's necessary for Yom Tiv can be done on Erev Pesach. Midi de tzarech Yom Tov shar Rabbanan. Midi de lav tzarech Yom Tov lo shar Rabbanan. Ultimately, again, so we'll say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, anything that is permitted, anything that's a Yom Tov need can be done. Anything that's not a Yom Tov need cannot be done. So therefore, even though the Brisa links them, in reality they are dissimilar. So I will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, what comes out from the sugya, what comes out from the Mishnah, the important principle is that halacha l'maisa, although you're not normally permitted to go ahead and make large purchases like homes, servants, and livestock, if you need it for chalamayid, you're allowed to, or if the seller doesn't have enough money, say ultimately in the purchase is the way to give the seller the money for what he needs for Yom Tov. That be permitted as well. The Gemara expands this, means it's not just the seller, but it's also a laborer. Poel ve'in lo ma'yochal. If you have a worker who doesn't have what he needs, you could hire him to do work on Chalamayid, not because you need the work, but ultimately, again, because he needs the money. Beautiful Mishnah. So we'll say in general, that is a great segue. We just said that on Chalamayid, what you have to be concerned with is tircha. And what we try to avoid is tircha. So based on that, in mefana mibayis labayis, we don't move stuff from one home to another home. I will say, what we're going to see what this means is, you don't move things from a home in one chatzar to a home in a different chatzar. Aval mefanuhu lechatzero. But ultimately, and what can you do? You can move things from a home to a chatzer. So we'll say in general, if you let's say you have utensils by a craftsman, you would not bring them back from the home of the craftsman to your home on Yom Tiv. But if you're concerned that maybe they're going to get stolen or damaged, then what? Then ultimately, again, you could take them from the house of the craftsman and just leave them in a different chatzer. Just don't bring them back to your house. So the idea that the Gemara is espousing over here is the concept that, once again, tircha. And here tircha is taking on a very simple and real example, moving stuff around. Says the Gemara, but I will say ultimately, again, so here's what's interesting. The Reisha seemed to say you can't move anything at all. Right, then the second line of the Mishnah said, but you can move stuff from the bayis to the chatzar. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, sefer ason labayis shebechatzar. So let's say Abaye like this. The first part of the Mishnah means you can't move stuff from a home in one chatzar to a home in another chatzar. The second line of the Mishnah is about what can you do? You can move stuff from your home to the chatzar, or from the chatzar to the home. So listen to this, Rav Papa says, one time Rava tested us, right? The Rebbe was giving a fire, he was giving a test to the Talmudim, and he said as follows, Tanan, on one hand, we learned in the Mishnah, you can't, Rebbe says, so again, before Yom Tiv, I deposited utensils at the house of a craftsman to make them, or I commissioned him to fix something or to make something. I can't bring that back. I can't bring that home from the base of Uman to my home on Chalamayid. Because we'll say, again, what's the concern? The concern is it looks like I'm engaging in normative commerce on Chalamayid. So we can't bring from base of Uman. Or Minu, Molichin Umavin Kelim base of Uman. Yet you have another Braisa, and what does the Braisa say? You could take Kelim to the base of Uman and bring Kelim back from the base of Uman. Right? So you could take and you could bring Va'afapi Shein L'Tzarech HaMoed. Even though I don't need these utensils for Chalamayid. So what's going on over here? Vishan there. We'll say, how do we resolve this contradiction? Kan ba'arba asar, kan b'chalosh HaMoed. We'll say, talking about two different times. Namely, what? One is talking about Yudalit Erev Pesach. So Erev Pesach, you're allowed to take utensils to the craftsman and bring them home, right? Versus Chalamayid, where you can't bring and you can't take. So the Gemara Sabachal Shamoid. So kan b'ma'amino, kan b'shenamino. But say, or another possible resolution. One is where you trust the craftsman, and one is where you don't. When you trust the craftsman, then what? Don't take anything home on Chalamayid. When you don't trust the craftsman, then you can pick it up from his home. Ultimately, again. Listen, I do want to point out, even though the Mishnah doesn't explicitly say, but it's understood that halacha l'maisa, anything you need for Chalamayid, of course, you can pick up from the house of the craftsman. In other words, let's say I left a pot and I need the pot, right? I need the pot. I'm allowed to pick that up. We're talking about cases where you don't need it for the tzorech hamoed. Say for Rabbi say, just keep in mind what we have. We have a Mishnah that tells us that halacha l'maisa, our Mishnah that we just read, that halacha l'maisa, you can't take things to the room, you can't pick it up. Now we have another brisa that says that you can take stuff and pick it up. How do you resolve that? So resolution number one is talking about Erev Pesach, one is about Chalamayid. Resolution number two, one is where you trust the craftsman, one is where you don't trust the craftsman. Amid Beis, Avatanya, we learned, Meviyim Kelim Beis Uman, that you're permitted to bring utensils home from the house of the Uman. Kigon, Kad mi Beis HaKadar, you could bring a jug, right, from the, or I should say you could bring a pot from the potter. Vikos mi Beis HaZagag, or a glass from the glass maker. Avalot semre mi Beis HaTzeva, but you can't bring home wool from the dyer. V'lo kelim mi Beis HaUman, or that matter, utensils from the house of the craftsman. Vim ein lo mayochal, but I will say if in any of these cases, the particular craftsman doesn't have money that he needs for Chalamayid, no sin lo scharo umanicho etzlo. Then in that case, what can you do, Rabbi Say? You can pay him. Now here's what's interesting. You can pay him, but what do you do with the utensil? You leave it there. So in other words, the ideal, apparently, based on this is, you're not really engaging in any type of commercial activity or commerce activity with the craftsman at all. But if it's a case where the craftsman doesn't have what he needs, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, you could pay him, but you leave the utensil there. What if you don't believe the craftsman? ultimately, again, then I will say, what can you do? You could pick up the utensil from the craftsman, but what? Don't bring it home. Don't bring it home. So you see this, again, Chazal did not want you engaging in just what appeared to be normative commerce activity. So you need to get it out of the home of the craftsman because you don't trust the guy. That's fine. Put it somewhere else. Take it from him, put it somewhere else. But if ultimately, again, you're concerned that the utensils, right, the objects may get stolen, ultimately, again, take it to a different chatzar. And I will say, at the end of the day, if still you're concerned, and I will say, let's say a person doesn't have an eitzah, there's nowhere for me to put the kelim, I'm afraid they're going to get stolen, I don't trust the craftsman, you can bring them into your house, but do it what? Do it privately, right? Do it a bit furtively, right? So that no one sees what you're doing. To which the Gemara says, Taratzta mevian. So you've now explained the case, ultimately, again, of mevian, of sometimes being able to pick up the utensil from the craftsman. Molichin kashya. But what about the contradiction about taking the utensil to the house of the craftsman? Diktani ein mevian, v'chol shekein she'ein molichin, ela mechavarta kidishanin meikar. Rather, Rabbi said the best way to resolve the machlokis or the stira over here is our first answer. Namely, Rabbi say what? One is talking about the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, and one is talking about Chalamayid. Rabbi said Erev Pesach, you are permitted to go ahead and take things to the craftsman and pick things up from the craftsman. Now, both say, you'll think to yourself, but it's Erev Yom Tov. Why would you think that you couldn't? Because also remember again, what's unique already about Erev Pesach? There are limitations about the nature of the malacha you can engage with. So because of that, I might have thought that I can't take or pick stuff up. Kamash balano, kamash on the halacha lamaisa, I'm allowed to go ahead and take stuff to the craftsman, pick stuff up from the craftsman on Erev Pesach, but on Chalamayid, I'm significantly limited, right? Really, I can't take stuff, I can't pick stuff up. It is only in situations where either there's a concern of theft or a general lack of trust, where I can't take anything, but I could pick stuff up, deposit it elsewhere. If there's nowhere else to deposit it, I can bring it home. Of course, if it's a case of tzorach hamoed, I need the utensil, then I'm permitted to pick it up as well. Beautiful. But says the Mishnah, so let's listen to this case. Let's say I have figs. Ketzios are figs that I have gone ahead and spread out in order to enable them to dry. So I say, now I want to spread some straw. I want to spread some straw over the figs to go ahead and protect them from the rain. So you can go ahead and protect the figs with straw. Rabbi Huda Omer af ma'abin. Not only, so both says, here's what's interesting. Mechasin means I'm covering the figs with a very thin layer of straw. Rabbi Huda says you could even cover them with a thick layer of straw. Thick layer of straw. So I'll say, so again, why would this be permitted? So b'pashtus, what this represents is a davara ovid, right? Ultimately, again, if I don't cover it with something, the produce may become ruined. Af ma'avin. Mochre peros, ksus the kelim. We'll say, people who sell produce, peros, ksus, clothing, kelim, utensils, mochrim bitsina l'tzorach hamoed. They could sell, but I will say ultimately again we tell them to sell bitsina. We'll see what that means bitsina. We tell them to sell it in a bit more of a private fashion. I was say, what's the concern? Even though these are clearly things that can be tzorach hamoed, we're concerned that it'll look like that you're purchasing things for post Yom Tov use. So therefore, we tell the sellers to kind of change the method in which they sell bitsina, hatzayadin v'hadashashos v'hagrusos osim bitsina tzorach hamoed. So we'll say, so tzayadin are hunters. So we're going to see the shashos are people who go ahead, grain pounders, right? They pound grain in order to make daisa. Daisa is like a type of porridge. Or grusos are people who go ahead and grind beans. So I'll say all of these individuals, so trappers, grain pounders, lentil pounders, osin bitsina. They could do their malacha, but they should do it bitsina, l'tzorach hamoed, and they could do it for the sake of chalama. Rabbi Yossi Omer, heim hechmir al atzman. Rabbi Yossi says, no, actually these individuals were machmir on themselves. We'll see what that means, machmir on themselves, for what in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, pligi ba, Rabbi Chibar, Abba Rabbi Yossi, v'tarvayo mishmei dechizkes. Well, let's listen to this. Rabbi Chibar, Abba Rabbi Asi argued, and they both argued in the name of Chizkiah. What did they argue about? So I'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, Mished Chizkiah, Rabbi Yochanan, Chad, right, Mished Chizkiah, Rabbi Yochanan, Chad Amar, Mechapin, Aklushe, Ma'aben Asmuche. So we'll say, listen to this. So we're just going to define our terms in the Mishnah, right? Remember again, both sides. The Mishnah began by saying that Mechapin, you can go ahead and you could cover figs with straw. Right? So that's Mechapin. And Rabbi Huda says Ma'abin. So the first opinion says as follows. Rabbi Yochanan says Mechapin means a thin layer of straw, and Ma'abin means a thick layer of straw. The Chayad Amar, the other opinion, said Mechapin, covering means Bein Aklushe, Bein Asmuche. That's a thin or thick layer of straw. So what's Ma'abin? Ma'abin is osa kaminkri. I take the figs and I pile the figs. I make the figs into a pile. Then I will say, now what's the chap with making the figs into a pile? Things are easier to cover if they're piled. Right? So by piling the figs, it's easier for me to cover them. Rashi says, kaminkri, machnis and osa biyachad, kedeshu nochen lachasos. I pile them together. Therefore, this way it is easier to go ahead and cover them. That supports this. Ma'abin, what does it mean? Ma'abin osa kaminkri, kedivrei Rabbi Huda. So we'll say, so it's just the machlokes in the terminology of the Mishnah. Ultimately, again, does mechapin mean just a thin layer of straw? Ma'abin, a thick layer of straw? Or maybe mechapin means thin or thick layer of straw. Ma'abin means I gather the produce into a pile and then cover it so that it's easier to cover. Good. Machlokes. Mochrei peros ksus kelim mocher mitzina. So remember again, the Mishnah said that those who sold peros, which is produce, ksus, clothing, kelim, utensils, they sell, but they sell bitzina. They sell privately. And now remember again, how did the Mishnah end? Rabbi Yossi said they were machmir on themselves. So so what does that mean? Ibaylahu. Heinech mira al atzma. What does it mean when you say that they are machmir on themselves? Lo havi avdi klal. Or what does it mean? That they wouldn't sell at all? In other words, that they were machmir, that the sellers, the merchants, technically speaking, they could sell, but they were machmir themselves not to sell. Or dilma to havi avdu b'tzina. Or no. Maybe what it means is, technically, Rabbi say all these people could sell normally. Why could they sell normally? Because if you think about all of these things, peros, right? Peros, ksus and kelim, right? Produce, clothing, and utensils. Technically speaking, these are all tzarchei Moed, which means that technically, halachically, they should be able to sell normally. They were machmir on themselves to only sell bitzina, in a bit more of a private fashion. We'll define what that means. So what's the chumrah? Was the chumrah they stopped selling altogether? Or the chumrah was they could really sell normally? They chose to sell in a little bit of a more private fashion. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Tashma mochrei peros ksus kelim mocher mitzina l'tzarech hamoed. So people who sell peros, ksus, and kelim, produce, clothing, and utensils, they go out and they sell a bit more privately for the sake of Yom Tov, sake of Chol Moed. Rabbi Yossi says, Tagri Tiveria, Hein Hechmiru al Aslon Shlim Mochrin Kol Iker. Rabbi Yossi said, by the way, the merchants of Tiveria were totally machmir on themselves that they don't sell at all. They don't sell at all. Sadeh chayos va'ofos v'dagim. So I'll say people who trap chayos, ofos, chayos are non-domestic animals, ofos, birds, dagim, fish, sudden bitzil tzarech hamoed. So they go ahead and they do their trapping, right, for the purpose of Yom Tov, but somehow they try to make they try to do it in a bit more of a private fashion. Rabbi Yossi says, Sadeh ako hi nechmiru al atzman shlo yitzadin kol ikar. Interesting enough, the fishermen of Akko, they didn't trap at all on Chol Moed. Deshushe chilka tigris v'tisni dosheshin b'tzina l'tzarech hamoed. So let's listen to this. Those who go ahead now, deshushe, Rashi says dashe tevua. Those who go ahead and thresh grain. They thresh grain. And I will say, now this is interesting. We'll define all of this, what this means. Those who thresh grain for the sake of making chilka, tigris, and tisni. We're going to see this is different types of crushed grain. So they would do their thing on Chol Moed, but they would do so b'tzina, and they would, of course, only do threshing l'tzarech hamoed. Rabbi Yossi says, the Shoshet Tzipporah hein hechniru al atzman shlo yudosheshin kol ikar. Rabbi Yossi says, by the way, the threshers of Tzipori they were machmir, and ultimately, again, they didn't do any threshing at all. Amar Abaye says, so we'll say, let's go back for just a moment. So we'll say, what it sounds like over here was that the chumrah was to go ahead and not do any work. In other words, what sounds like the way the Gemara is saying is like this. Really, the halacha is that you could do what you need to do. Anything that is a chalamai type service can be done, but what? Should be done with sinah. The chumrah was people who decided to close up shop in totality over chalamai. That was the chumrah. So we'll say, so now the Gemara just wants to define some terms. Because he spoke about the grain threshers who made chilka, tigris, and tisni. What's chilka, tigris, and tigni? So chilka, chad l'shayin. We'll say chilka means the process of taking a grain kernel and making one grain kernel into two, splitting it in half. Tigris, chad l'tlas, is taking one grain kernel, splitting it into three. Tisni, chad l'arba, one grain kernel, taking it into four, splitting it into four. Good. Ki as Rav Dimi Amar. When Rav Dimi came along, he said, no, kunsa. I will say, look at Rashi, kunsa, kosemes, shalosesin, osa, hainu, chilka. Chilka is actually nothing to do with wheat, but rather chilka is taking spelt, right? Going in and crushing spelt. So Meisei, the Gemara says, chilka, tigris, vitisni, timein b'chol makom. So let's listen to this. So we learned, we'll say, totally unrelated brisa. Chilka, tigris, and tisni are tamei anywhere. Now what does this mean? So if you look at Rashi says over here, mekablin tuma. It means chilka, tigris, and tisni are always mekabel tuma. Now watch this. So now we have a fundamental machlokas as to what chilka, tigris, and tisni is. The first opinion said chilka, tigris, and tisni is a wheat kernel that's split either into 2 parts, 3 parts, or 4 parts. Second opinion said, no, it's not wheat, it's spelt. So we'll say, now watch this. Say if you say that chilka, tigris, and tisni is a wheat kernel split into multiple parts, it makes sense ultimately again that they're makabel tuma. Now both say, remember again, tuma 101. You can only be makabel tuma if what? If you come in contact with a liquid, right? There has to be hochshar l'tuma. So I'll say the only way to split these kernels is if you've soaked them. That's the only way to split them. So therefore it makes sense that they're makabel tuma. So the Gemara says, kunsa amai timei b'chol makom halo is kasher. I will say, but if you just say it refers to spelt, not split spelt, but just spelt, then ultimately why did it be makabel tuma? Who says they ever came in contact with liquid? To which the Gemara says, kigon to mekalfon. No. Even according to the opinion who defines this as different kinds of spelt, ultimately, again, it's peeled spelt. And I will say, how do you peel spelt? You first soak it. The ilav, the shayla lubamaya, they'll have a mekalfa. Ultimately, again, because had you not first soaked it, you would not be able to peel it. Va'amai karile chilka. So why do you call it chilka? The shakel chilkayu, because you took away its peel. Good. So the Gemara says as follows. In other words, called chilka. Again, Rashi points out, it's called chilka. You took away its peel, and because you took away the peel, therefore what? It's smooth. So chilka, lashon of chalak. Chalak means smooth. Beautiful. Meisei raised the kasha. Hanodra min haddagan aser bepula mitzri yavesh umuter balach umuter ba'ores. So let's listen to this. If a person makes a neder not to get benefit from grain, right? So the Shana Rabosai, of course, becomes how expansive is the term grain. So a person who makes an neder not to benefit from grain, he is aser even by pul mitzri yavesh. So it's like pul mitzri is an Egyptian lentil, an Egyptian bean. He's not permitted to go and consume a pul mitzri yavesh dry, umuter balach, but he is permitted to go ahead and consume one that is moist. Umuter ba'orez bechilka v'tigris v'tisni, and he's permitted to eat rice, chilka, tigris, and tisni. So I'll say, so bishlan l'mandam rechadla tarti, chadla tlas, v'chadla arba shapir, dinaf kilu mitoras dagan. So I'll say, if you hold that chilka, tigris, and tisni is a wheat kernel that was split either into 2 parts, 3 parts, or 4 parts. So it makes sense, therefore, that halacha l'maisa what? a person who makes a neder not to eat grain is permitted to eat these items. Why? Because since the kernel has been split up into so many parts, therefore what? It no longer has the status of dagan, of wheat. So the Gemara says, Damar kunsa. But if you hold that it refers to spelt, dagan ma'al yehu, then ultimately it's proper grain. And if it's proper grain, then why should you be able to eat it if you made a neder not to consume grain? To which the Gemara says, kasha. So I just want to point out the chilka tigris tisni is an unresolved dispute, just a definitional dispute. Does it refer just to spelt, just all it refers to spelt, or does it refer to a wheat kernel which is broken up in different ways? That's the fundamental machlokes. Incredible. So we'll say the Gemara says as follows: Rav Huna shari lehu lahana krufaisa lemezal lezabuni kirchaya b'shuka. So let's listen to this. So Rav Huna allowed these krufaisa. What's krufaisa? Mochre b'samim. People who go ahead and sell b'samim. Right. So we'll say these people sold different spices. He allowed them to go ahead and sell their spices in the normal fashion in the shuk. Okay, so says the Gemara, Eisvei Rav Kahana, so Rav Kahana raised the kasha, Chanos Psucha Listav. So we'll say, so now again, the point over here to focus on is as follows. Rav Huna allowed them to sell in the normal way. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because the Mishnah kind of made it sound like that even people who have a license to sell on Chalamayid, what do they have to do? Bitsina, whatever Bitsina means, right? But Bitsina means some type of deviation from normal commerce practices. So yet Rav Huna allowed these Krufaisa to go ahead and sell normally. So the Gemara says, Eisir Rav Kana, Chanos Psucha L'Stav. If you have a store that opened up into a stav. Now, we'll say stav, Rashi says over here, is Eino Pasol Shturabim. So we'll say a stav is just almost like an area with benches. So it's an area, Rashi says over here, Rashi says, it's not the public thoroughfare. So essentially you have a store that kind of opens up into more of like a courtyard area. There's not a lot of pedestrian traffic. Ultimately, again, it can open up on Chalamayid in a normal way. Since it's not open to the general public, it can open up in a normal way. However, again, if the store opens your Sarabim, then poseach achas v'no achas. So this is very interesting. Often stores would have two doors, right? So what could you do? Open one door, leave one door closed. So let's say, so the one door open means, we're open for business, it's Chalamayid, but one door closed means Bitsina. Ve'erev Yom Tov Achron Shachag, Motzi Uma'ater Shukye Erev Peros Shel Kavod Yom Tov Achron. So we'll say, but yet, listen to this. On Erev Yom Tov Achron, so we'll say, so for example, let's say by Sukkot this would be Hoshana Rabbah, right? By Pesach it would be the last day of Chalamayid. So the stores, right? They throw their doors wide open, put out all of their wares. Now why? Because they're enabling people to go ahead and sell to buy for the last day's Yom Tov. So Gemara says, "Nei kavod Yom Tov acharon in shalom kavod Yom Tov, shalom nei kavod Yom Tov lo." Now, what's interesting about this is as follows. It seems like the only reason they have a license to go ahead and to sell normally is because of kavod Yom Tov acharon. But for the rest of Chalamayid, they could sell. But how do they have to sell? Bitsina. So I will say, the kasha over here is on Rav Huna, because Rav Huna allowed the spice salesmen to keep their stores open normally without any type of deviation or change. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Lokasha, habeperi, habetavlin. So I'll say, interestingly enough, Rav Huna allowed the spice merchants to go ahead and sell normally. The people who sell peros had to sell a little bit differently. Wherein lies the distinction? Look at Rashi. Habeperi, shishlach shot shekon letzorach imos hashana. So both say the general concern with purchasing from stores is: are people purchasing for the sake of Chalamayid or potentially for after Yom Tov? Here's what's interesting: the derech of spices, and this is fascinating. It's so different today. People Bismana Gemara only bought fresh spices. So if you were buying spices on Chalamayid, it was clear that why were you buying it? For Chalamayid or last day's Yom Tov. There was no such thing as buying spices for some time later on. Therefore, Rav Huna said the spice shops, they can operate normally because that's the type of industry where it's clear that whatever you're buying, whatever you're doing, ultimately again is for Yom Tov. But other types of commerce, or other types, even food items, let's say peiros, there's a possibility that a person is buying for after Yom Tiv, and therefore, again, the halacha is that those stores have to operate in what we call a little bit more of a bitzina fashion. I'll say, I'll just mention, I have the great zuchos to travel to Eretz Yisrael today, so I'm going to be gone for the next couple days. But my intention is still in Eretz Hashem to give the shir, so I'll be here with you on the big screen. On the big screen, Miriam Hashem. So I know that if I'm not here, it's tempted to say, well, if Shmuel Silber's not here, so I could watch it from home as well. So that's so, again, to those on Zoom, fantastic. But again, but Lamaisi, again, that's so much of the power of us learning together is coming to the Beis Medrash, coming to learn together, coming to daven together. So again, Baruch Hashem, I'm committed to you. I'm gonna be on the screen in Meretz Hashem every day. There might be one day where I have to pre-record it, then it'll be shown. But in Meretz Hashem, I'll be here with you every single day. So I would just urge you, let's keep up the Retzifos, let's keep up the Eslavos, let's keep the Kol Torah going on in the Beis Medrash. Hadjun alach misha hafach, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov.